In this video, I'll walk through how to render a World of Warcraft character model directly in the browser using wowhead's model viewer. This is the same setup I use on Hogger.io, a classic WoW armory that displays gear, runes, talents, the character model, etc. Everything here is rendered client-side, no Unity or custom rendering engine, just wowhead's model viewer. The wowhead model viewer code is publicly available through its CDN at zamimage.com, which is operated by Tencent. It's the same viewer wowhead uses for their own site. You can find a minified JavaScript file here. I recommend downloading this file and adding it directly to your project. Hosting it locally gives you more control and avoids issues with availability or breaking changes to the CDN. Now that we have the model viewer code, we need to supply it with the data it expects. Rather than working directly with the viewer file, I'm using a small wrapper library called wow-model-viewer. It simplifies integration by exposing easy-to-use APIs and handles some of the asset loading internally. I suggest downloading the code from this repo directly, since you may need to tweak it a bit depending on the front-end framework you're using. In my case, I'm using Next.js. The main API is generate models, which takes in 3 arguments. First, the aspect ratio. I usually leave this at 1. Second, the ID of the HTML element where the model should be rendered. And then 3, which is the most important, a character object with fields like race, gender, appearance, and items. The items array contains objects with slot IDs and display IDs. If you scroll down in the README, there's a table mapping of slot IDs. For example, 1 is head, 3 is shoulders, and so on. Let's talk about display IDs. The model viewer requires display IDs, not just item IDs. These determine which 3D model to use for each item. Unfortunately, the Blizzard/Equipment API only returns item IDs, not display IDs. And as far as I know, there isn't a reliable official API to get them. The easiest way to get an individual item's display ID is by inspecting the View in 3D button on its wowhead item page, which isn't very intuitive. Let's walk through a specific example using Immolation Face Guard, an iconic paladin helmet from Cataclysm. To find the display ID, we can open the wowhead page for the item, right-click the View in 3D button, and select Inspect. In the HTML, you'll see a div with data-mv-display-id attribute. The number is the display ID used by the model viewer. That said, this process isn't scalable if you're rendering dynamic gear pulled from the Blizzard API. Manually inspecting the button for each item will be very time-consuming. There are some data dumps out there from private servers, but they're usually incomplete or messy. To get around this, I scraped wowhead's item search pages and built my own item ID to display ID mapping, which I store in a database. It's worked well so far, and I'm happy to share a cleaned up data dump if that's helpful for anyone. Now that we understand how the viewer works, let's look at how it loads assets. The viewer fetches textures, 3D models, and metadata files from wowhead's CDN at wow.zamimage.com. For example, here's a link that's loading the texture for a specific belt item. These files are publicly accessible, but CORS is protected. CORS stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. It's a browser security feature that blocks JavaScript from making requests to another domain unless that domain explicitly allows it. For instance, wowhead is probably on the allow list for wow.zamimage.com, but our local application is not. If you try to load one of these assets directly from the browser, you'll see a CORS error in the Network tab. To get around this, the WoW model viewer repo recommends setting up a proxy using bypass-cors-policies. This proxy forwards requests to the CDN, and since it's not a browser to server communication, we're able to bypass CORS. This setup works well for small personal projects, but if you're building something larger, consider hosting a mirror of commonly used assets. Once your proxy server is up, you can define the content path for the model viewer. By default, wow-model-viewer expects this path to be defined using the window.content path. If your framework complicates access to the window object, like in Next.js, I recommend modifying the wrapper to accept the content path as a direct argument instead. That's what I did, and it works well. Another note, Blizzard's appearance endpoint would ideally return hairstyle, hair color, and other cosmetic options, but it seems to have not been working for a while. That said, most characters are fully geared, so these details aren't usually visible anyway. Here I set up a small sandbox environment where I'm using the Generate Models API to render a character model. In this case, I'll be rendering a human with some Cataclysm gear on. Let's start by trying to load the assets directly from wow.zamimage.com to show the CORS interaction. As expected, we get a 403 forbidden error here. Now I'll switch over to using the port that my local instance of bypass proxy is running on. This should work, and yeah, now we could see the human character rendered successfully with some Cataclysm gear. Let's try a different setup now. I'll switch to a dwarf wearing some hunter gear. So commenting out the paladin gear, changing the race to 3, which maps to dwarf. And let's see if that works. Cool, and that also works too. Pretty cool to see how easy it is to swap models and test different combinations of gear. I may open source this code if anyone's interested in taking a look or contributing, so feel free to leave a comment if interested. Thanks for watching.